Okay, team, I think we are ready to go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our budget development process for fiscal year 2022-2023 Community Forum. I am Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez, Superintendent, and I am so pleased to be joined by our Chief Financial Officer, Chief Philip Penn, who is also going to be part of the presentation. And I'm going to pause just so that we can take care of some logistics regarding translation.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Para todos aquellos que necesiten interpretación al español, estas son las instrucciones a seguir. Haga clic en el enlace de Zoom que se le envió por correo electrónico en la última hora. Vamos a estar utilizando la interpretación de Zoom para proporcionar la interpretación al español. Cuando usted entra al seminario, usted va a mirar hacia el lado derecho abajo en la barra del menú donde usted puede ver las reacciones, puede ver el área de Q&A, de preguntas y respuestas. Ahí usted va a encontrar un globo terráqueo que va a decir Interpretation o interpretación. Cuando usted hace clic en ese globo terráqueo, usted va a ver los idiomas, va a decir English, Spanish, inglés o español. Usted selecciona español y luego una vez esté en ese, usted puede ajustar el volumen del audio original. Si usted lo quiere seguir escuchando el audio original, puede subir y bajar el volumen o puede completamente darle mute y solamente escuchar a nuestra intérprete Lady Ann, que está haciendo un excelente trabajo.
Thank you, Ms. Alvarado. And if we can go to the next slide so that we can talk about the goals, the objectives for tonight's presentation. So it is important to us that our community, all of you, have transparency into the school budget development process and how it is impacted by the larger fiscal context here in Hartford Public Schools in the city of Hartford. Of course, as we understand it today, and so we will share information with you that seeks to do two things. One is for all of us to get an understanding of the current funding for Hartford Public Schools, and as part of that, we'll go into a little bit of the historical situation, how things have looked like before, and also how the federal stimulus dollars play into the financial outlook. And then also, we're going to learn about how money is allocated to schools through the budget development process. Who makes the decisions about how money gets to the schools? What information do we consider? What exactly is the timeline and all those steps? Because there are many steps, as Chief Penn is going to share, as to the development of the actual budget for a school, but then also, right, for the entire district. In my next slide, please. Thank you. So for us, when we talk about resources, we're talking about people, staffing, the time, how we schedule the time in schools, and then of course money, how we invest in programs and supports and for our students. And so our resources are allocated in alignment with our mission, the vision, and the priorities of our district model of excellence. Some of you have seen this image before, and it really just summarizes the 4 priorities that we heard several years ago from our engagement with our community, and that we continue to hear. We heard these again recently last spring when we did our updating of our strategic plan. So we're gonna jump right in and address, right, I mentioned that there were 2 key learnings for this evening. And the first one is for us to get an understanding of what exactly is the current picture in terms of funding in Hartford Public Schools. And I'm gonna ask our colleague here, Chief Penn, to take us there.
Thank you, Superintendent. And it's good to be with everybody tonight. We appreciate the time together. Let me give you a quick synopsis of how our schools are funded in terms of total revenue. And you can see here for fiscal 21-22, we're expecting to have total revenue somewhere around 430 million, and that excludes any of our COVID relief funds. And you can kind of see stretching back over the last 3 years or so that revenues have been fairly flat. We've seen an increase in our state funding levels as ECS has become more fully funded, primarily through the Alliance grant that we receive. Our local funding, which also includes about $188 million of what's called the Education Cost Sharing Grant, has stayed relatively flat over that time frame. And our federal funding is actually dropping, and that's a function of the enrollment that we have within our schools right now. But imagine, if you will, what the pressure is that we see from inflation on a school district of our size. 3% inflation, which is, some would say, is the long-term base that you would use on expenditures of about $400 million, means that our costs on average will increase about $12 million a year. So the stress that we feel as a school district from a financial standpoint is, unless our revenues are moving up by the same $12 million a year, we wind up having a structural deficit within our budgetary process. And a matter of fact, if we go to the next slide, you'll see how our expenses have tracked over time. And you can see here, 425 million, 429 million, 426, 423, and some of that clearly is impacted by the pandemic. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that school districts have to end the school year within their budget allotment. We're not allowed by state law to go over. In fact, our board members can be held personally responsible for that if that happens. So we strive very hard to make sure it doesn't happen. And I can't really think of an example anywhere in the state where that's happened, because CFOs like myself spend an awful lot of time trying to manage through our expenses to make sure we stay within our means. But if we go to the next slide, the superintendent can kind of talk to some of the key points that have developed over the last few years in terms of keeping those expenses down.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Penn. And for those of you that are joining us and that have joined us in previous years, you might remember that this is a slide that we continue to bring up during the budget cycle, because it really paints a picture of some of the hard decisions that we've had to collectively make in order to kind of bridge the gap in terms of our deficit. So we have been in a cycle of budget deficit mitigation for each year up to the pandemic, right? So it's had an increase in vacancies and other small savings from the remote and hybrid settings, right, as we went through the pandemic. But when you think about it and you look back over the years in previous budgets, we see that we've had to mitigate a total of $117 million. So, you know, I remember my first budget, $24 million mitigation, and then it continued. We did see a decrease, and we know that there were some savings as a result of our work over 3 years to finalize the consolidation of our 12 facilities. So yes, there were some savings, but we also had to reduce on some staffing. And if you see there at the bottom across where it says schools, we've had to reduce a total of 300 positions across schools. We were able to add in fiscal year 19-20, but nonetheless, that's a significant shift when we know that we have so many needs. And the same at central office, because you know, as Chief Penn is gonna share later, there are staff that are allocated at central office as well. And so, as you can see, we also reduced our central office staff allocation over 5 years by close to 87 positions. The other piece that is important for us to take into consideration is our enrollment. Enrollment decline is a significant contributor to having revenue that doesn't really shift, right? A trend that was made even worse by the pandemic. And so when we think about enrollment, and some of you might remember when we were, you know, thinking about consolidating the schools, one of the things that we learned was that because the enrollment is spread across all schools, it's not like enrollment reductions is happening in only one school, it's across all schools across the district. Our ability to adjust our funding in response to those enrollment losses are very limiting, especially when we're thinking about it year to year. And so it really does still remain a major piece of our financial picture. How do we really solve for that when it kind of cuts across the entire district and it impacts all schools? So over the next 3 years, some of you might also remember some of these images. We have an unprecedented influx of federal stimulus. What a great opportunity for us to have additional funding to support, not only academic, but social and emotional recovery. So $144 million, and it does give us the much needed resources to accelerate that recovery and even redesign some of our efforts that are necessary because of the pandemic. And of course, the inequitable impact that it has had on our students in Hartford. So we're really trying to be very mindful as to how do we take advantage of all of this while we keep in mind what Chief Penn said to us about, there are a lot of uncertainties for us still. And just as a reminder, our general fund dollars are focused on resourcing our strategic plan initiatives. So what we did, as some of you might recall, our stimulus dollars were intentionally aligned to accelerate specific areas most important for student well-being and learning that were also connected to our strategic plan. So it's all part of the same plan. And after 50 hours of stakeholder engagement with teachers, administrators, our students, our families, our community partners, and also we looked at this, what our student data was showing. We made decisions to have investments in, as you can see here, some examples: intervention supports in schools, curriculum and professional learning, increased mental health services in our schools, and of course, a lot of attention and resources to deepening and expanding our teacher pipeline and recruitment. We heard that was a need. We saw it, and we also heard it from many of our stakeholders that we want to have more teachers, specifically teachers of color, and we have to get better at recruiting them, supporting them, and keeping them. And Chief Penn, tagging you back in for Fiscal Outlook.
Sure. So as the superintendent just went through, there's a lot of really good things happening in the way that we're spending our COVID relief dollars. Now, unfortunately, though, those COVID relief dollars will run out. And what we talk about, if you've ever heard us use the term fiscal cliff before, this is kind of what we're referring to. That after 23-24, the fiscal dollars associated with the COVID relief funds go away. We're not allowed to use any more of them after that date. So our operating expenses will continue to grow over the next 3 years. And then the question then becomes, well, if our operating revenue didn't grow the same way over that time frame, we're still going to have structural costs that needs to be addressed in trying to make those revenues and expenses closer together. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we're working on right now is what we call a fiscal sustainability project. And the way I've tried to define fiscal sustainability is that your revenues or expenses are growing at the same rate going forward, so that you're not constantly chasing the deficit mitigation that the superintendent had shown on the previous slide. So what we're trying to take into account are projections around revenues and expenses out over the next 3 to 5 years. Looking at all our bargaining contracts that are being negotiated right now. What do we think is going to happen with enrollment over that time period? What are the possible implications of chef settlements going forward? Increased student needs. Even though our population overall may be decreasing, the concentration of special education services, English learners, and our chronic absenteeism is rising within that population. How do we utilize the dollars that we have now for this federal stimulus funding to try to slow that growth? and vacancy trends in staffing, right? We know we're at a 5% vacancy rate right now. It's saving us money in terms of salary, but that's not a savings we want to have, because ultimately that's not good for the students. So how do we model out, with all the efforts that I know are going on with our Office of Talent Management, what's vacancy going to look like going forward? Next slide, please. So how do we look at all of our big buckets to spend now going forward? We know we have increasing tuition costs for our magnet programs that are not run by Hartford Public Schools. How do we slow that growth going forward? How do we re-attract those students back to Hartford Public Schools? We have rising costs that we know are associated with special education services and outplacements. We're legally mandated to provide those services to our students. But is there a way that we can bring those back in district and not rely upon outplacements of students instead? How do we address the overall decline in in-district enrollment? And how do we model for our costs? Now, the thing is, you know that we're subject to inflation like everybody else is right now. And if you've paid for food recently, or if you paid for gasoline recently, you know that the rate of inflation has ticked up quite a bit. And that's something that concerns us going forward in terms of like how we model out these long-term costs. So as part of that process, we have a lot of stakeholder engagement planned over the next several months, right? In a week from tonight, I'll be updating the Board of Education's Finance Committee sort of on key findings around this fiscal sustainability project. We have a public hearing scheduled for our budget in late January, I know. We're going to be gathering feedback from principals, from teachers, from students and family groups as we go to develop these things going forward. Ongoing board review in the February and March timeframe as we start getting more crystallized around what we think we can do going forward. And then engaging with our union leadership and saying, this is where we think we're going to go with these strategies. Do these make sense to you? Is there a way that you would do it differently? Because we know that if we can take in feedback and do sort of this 360 review of what we're trying to do, we'll wind up in a much better place. And ultimately, we want to try and land around the April and May timeframe with a go-forward plan to how to implement all this. So how does the school budget development process work? Let me turn it back to the superintendent.
Yes, and I actually am going to, in our next slide, speak to how did we get here, and then go into the pieces of the budget development process. So a few years ago, when we were working through the budget, there were some pain points, quite frankly, and I wanted to kind of take a step back and improve the process, because part of me also didn't understand it when I got here. And so we approached it like we approach many other things, just like Chief Penn was talking about, engaging other stakeholders. And we got feedback from our stakeholders, and we realized that there were some key areas and trends that were identified as improvement areas. One was transparency, that people defined as like schools really don't understand exactly how resources are allocated to schools. No one could really explain how the resource got there. And so we committed to trying to solve for that. And what we did was, in collaboration with our stakeholders, we now have a clearly defined and publicly available formula that Chief Penn is going to talk about how the resources are allocated. Something else that came up was equity, and that schools were not receiving funding that was consistent with the needs of students. So we said, okay, moving forward, when we improve the budget process, we're going to ensure equity, and that means that schools are going to receive funding consistent with their student needs. And how we did that is allocating certain resources based on specific needs. For example, chronic absenteeism, resources that our English learners weren't receiving that they were supposed to receive. And now, as we think about it, we're now thinking through the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic is having. Another piece was stability. This one didn't really come out from the stakeholders, but it was one that was important to me because we realized that While there were some schools that were receiving more funding than others that needed it, for example, there were magnet schools that were receiving a little more than others. And so while we wanted to get at equity, I also thought that we had to just be very careful on how we do that, because we also didn't want to completely disrupt the offerings, the programming, the resources that our students were able to access in magnet schools, because they also were supporting and serving our students. And so what we did was we had a cap on year over year gains and losses for schools. And then another significant piece, and this one was very important for our school leaders, was flexibility, because school leaders were really not sure what flexibilities they had. School leaders and school governance councils, they weren't sure what flexibilities they had with the school funding. So we defined that as we, the district, the finance team was going to give schools clear outlines about the flexibilities that they had, because, right, we don't want someone saying, well, I don't think I want to have social workers in our schools. Well, there's, we have to talk about that. And so now there's very clear guidelines as to what is up for flexibility in spending and what is not. And timelines was something else. This was brought up by principals as well, and some staff at central office around timelines, that the budget timeline was very late. There were times up until three budget cycles in which we were approving, the board was approving the budget in May. There was a time and it was June. And so we had a really hard time because we really wanted to get ahead of hiring staff, and we weren't able to do that. And so by the time the budget was passed, it was July when we could offer teachers, especially new teachers, a contract. And by then, other districts had, moved faster than us. So we said, we're going to try to continue to work on improving earlier on and getting the budget passed earlier on. And lastly, strategic alignment. This one was a lot of different groups identified this. People were saying, I don't know that schools or the district is creating a budget that really connects to our priorities. And so we've worked really hard over the years. I think last year into this year is probably the most alignment that we have had with our priorities. And so I know this was a long time spent on this slide, but only because there were a lot of, interactions and feedback loops that we had. And over the years, we have continued to improve on the process. So here we are when we think about, okay, there were some commitments that we made to improve the process. And so as it relates to a one-year budget, we are going to think about some of those key commitments that we made, but also we're thinking about it with an eye toward the future. So stability, right? Again, we're going to have our equity-based funding, which is like the foundation to the budgets. And again, making sure that the investments, the resources are aligned to the priorities, so that, we might have good ideas for programs, but we have to really think about, are they aligned to our priorities? And then simplicity. We want to make the process simple with tools and processes. And that one links to transparency, not only in who gets to make the decision, right? What are the dollars that the school leaders are going to work with SGCs to allocate? What are the dollars that we as central office, as part of the budget formula, get to allocate? And sustainability. That is making sure that we're able to sustain or carry out some of these things out in future years, because we want to make sure that we are getting what we call a return on the investment, that the resources are going to translate into student outcomes. And we also want to have sustainability around national recruiting and retention. We want to be able to compete with other districts and other states on getting staff to our district early on. And then fiscal sustainability projects. And that is a project that Chief Penn is leading to make sure that we try to find a way to kind of stabilize the work moving forward and the resources to support the work. And lastly, thinking about what are those short-term decisions? What are decisions that we're making now that, don't sacrifice in the long term what we want to do? So it's very tricky, the situation that we're in, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be creative. And so Chief Penn, maybe you can speak to, what some of those things could look like.
That's right. Thanks, Superintendent. If we go on to the next slide now, when we ability from the point of view of how we're building this out, we're really trying to implement with fidelity the equity-based funding formula. We're going to cover that in a little more detail in a couple of slides. But we're really trying to stick to that. And then we adopted Allaview. I never heard about Allaview before I came to the district, but I'm finding that it's a pretty nice little tool that sits in between our budgeting software and the needs of people that are entering the needs into the system, but don't necessarily have a financial background like I do. And it makes it very clear to kind of understand where the spend is taking place. So it helps to build out the simplicity of what everybody is able to view. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, it also expands out who's got visibility into how those budgets come together. And then as an example, we've been able to enable all our SGC chairs to have access to Allaview so they can see the budget as it's being built and as changes are being made, so that the school governance councils can then provide input to the local school principal on how that stuff is coming together as we go forward. Phase 3 for that process will be eventually we're going to have a tool availability for the public so that you can drill down into a particular school's budget or look at the overall district budget in a way that makes it accessible to everybody. And as the superintendent talked about, this is really all about sustainability, right? Trying to make sure that all these things are being met, not just for fiscal year 23, which is what we're building right now, but for the long term. Don't cause a bigger problem down the road by fixing something today in a way that doesn't really make sense. Okay. Let's hop to the next slide if we could then. So who's got a stakeholder in the budget development process? And the short answer is everybody who's on this slide. School leaders and their school governance councils, central office staff, that's my budget team. It is the executive directors of school leadership. It's everybody at the cabinet level, certainly the superintendent, who I like to say has this 51% vote on some of this stuff. And then it goes to the public elected officials or to our board members to make sure that they've got involvement in this. Community members like yourselves that are joining us here tonight have a say in how we approach the budgetary process. And it's important that we have sort of, again, that 360 view as the budget comes together. My job usually has me here in central office almost 100% of the time. I can't really opine on what's the best expenditure of money in a particular school in the same way that a school governance council member or that school leader is going to have, because he or she is going to have the most detailed knowledge of what the needs of that particular school are. So everybody here has got a stake in the process. And so I'm glad that we have these opportunities to have touch points with the community to bring in their opinion and to help us craft this process as we go forward. So where are we in the process? Let's scroll on to the next slide then. What you're going to see out of these next two slides is this is a fairly lengthy and time-consuming process, but it's also the fastest I've ever seen working in public education, from the start of when we kick this off to when the board's going to vote on it. And that's a good thing. One of the things that we're really trying to do with this process, and if it feels accelerated or early to you, it should, because what we're trying to do is create a competitive advantage, right? We compete for teacher resources and other resources against every other district in Connecticut. You got something like 30 districts within a fairly short drive of downtown Hartford. All those districts are looking for the same resources that we are. So if we're waiting until May or June to make offers to people, pretty good chance we're not going to get as many people as you like. If we flip the switch on this process and we get to a way that we can start making those offers in February, that's a game changer for us in terms of our hiring practices. So right now we're in the community engagement phase that we had scheduled out for tonight, December 8th. There are 41 budget review meetings going on right now this week between my staff, myself, the other school leaders, in terms of reviewing what the requests are for each of these budgets, particularly with respect to personnel changes, because in a district our size, that's where the majority of the money gets spent is on personnel. There's a second layer of budget discussions with the School Governance Council set for next week. Whereas a cabinet, we're going to look at what strategic investments and disinvestments we could potentially make. And then if we can scroll on to the next slide, we start rolling up all that data and submitting into the finance team so that we can make sure they don't have any errors in there, to make sure any of the investments we want to make are incorporated in. Looking for the financial sustainability project. Is there any potential actions that we can take short term that can affect 22, 23? And with the view that we're going to be sharing this with the Board of Education's Finance Committee in January. We've got another public hearing on the budget scheduled after that, a budget workshop with the full BOE, and I apologize that I don't have the updated dates on this, but we'll have it on our website shortly. And then finally, leading up to a final review with the Finance Committee on February 9th, and hopefully a Board of Education adoption of the budget on February 15th. And if we pull all that off, that really allows us to really move quickly with putting postings up and trying to attract quality talent to the district going forward. Okay. So it's a long process in the sense that there's a lot of steps, but as I said at the outset, it's a fairly quick one in terms of how we compare to a lot of other districts in which I've operated. So let's talk about a little bit about what the equity model looks like and what kind of flexibility schools have. And I have to give Hartford a lot of credit with this. If we can go to the next one, actually, John, that'd be great. When I was working in New Haven, prior to coming to Hartford, I took a sneak peek at how you were putting your budget together. And I came across this and I'm like, wow, this is really unique. I had not seen a model that went down to this level of detail and really tried to focus what are precious resources in terms of dollars to where they're needed most within each individual school. And that's really what this model was designed to accomplish. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation that we're doing tonight, try to remember that equity doesn't mean equal, right? Equity means you're putting the dollars to where the resources are needed the most, right? So what you'll see here is a number of mathematical calculations, formulas, if you will, on how we look at principals and assistant principals, teachers and how they're up to class size mandates, school counselors and social workers. How do we look at supplies? How do we look at stipends? And if we go to the next page, we'll also talk about how do we look at supplemental teachers for multilingual learners? How do we try to decide where those resources should land? What do we do with student engagement specialists? We know that our chronic absenteeism is a key concentration for us right now. How do we make sure that every school's got the resources that they need to lower the chronic absenteeism rate? And then looking at what kind of flexible dollars do schools have to decide as best for themselves what the spending should be. So we're trying to implement this with Fidelity now for the first time this year in a way that makes sense. Candidly, we've had to do a couple of iterations of this as the budget process has gone on. What we've learned, for instance, is that you can't round down when it comes to a staff member. You generally have to round up. But it's that kind of tweaking that we have to go through as we're sort of implementing this. And I guess the one caution I might throw out there is we're also trying to implement this in a pandemic, right? The pandemic's not over yet. It's like we have to kind of keep that in mind as we go through all these changes that we're trying to address, that there's still something else happening in the background that may still shift dollars around to where they're needed, even as we try to address those pandemic needs. And lastly, I don't want you to come away with the impression that this is a cookie cutter approach, right? That there's only a hard formula and the formula determines that, and that there's no other human intervention at all. That's not the case at all. We know that you can't take a cookie cutter approach. So even after looking at the detailed models, there's another review that takes place internally here to make sure that we've addressed needs where there are extenuating circumstances within a particular school, or where the model doesn't really capture what's taking place dynamically within that school. Again, without violating the equity model, to say that there's a special consideration here that needs to be addressed. So there's a lot of work that's taking place this week and next week along those lines. And I will tell you, after having sat through about 25 of those budgetary meetings so far, it's a really robust discussion. And it's good for everybody to be hearing the same level of feedback and capturing a lot of notes that we're all going to go back to, and we're kind of working from the same sheet of music as we go through this process. I think that makes things a lot easier. To the next slide then. So why is potentially a starter budget change? Well, obviously enrollment can change from year to year. Our district model for excellence, we want to make sure that we're continuing to invest in those strategic priorities. Resource availability, and this is one that's a risk for us, right? We don't necessarily know with 100% certainty what our funding level is going to be for 22-23 yet. That's subject to the federal government, the state government, and other philanthropic contributions that we may receive that could come in higher or lower than what we're modeling today. And that's a risk, and we're going to have to adapt ourselves once we know definitively, once we know what those numbers are. And then lastly, we know that we have ESSER funds that are available to us. How do we make sure we're maximizing those dollars, which again have a finite endpoint, to make sure that we're spending those dollars in the best way possible to support all the objectives that we have in terms of the equity model and all the additional supports that we're trying to build into for students with that COVID funding relief that we have. And the last thing I think I want to point out here, and I think maybe I have one more slide after this, is don't forget that central office expenditures also have an impact on schools. Everybody that you see here, even though they may be considered a central office expenditure, also has an impact on what we do at the school level and the supports that are given to schools. And so we may budget schools differently at the individual level, and you wouldn't see these costs necessarily reflected here. But to the extent that any of these folks are tied to central office, we continue to have those expenditures support what's going on in the school activity. Right. And then the last thing is just looking at different levels of per pupil funding at different schools. Just kind of keep in mind that at a grade level does matter. Pre-K to 5 typically requires more teachers than you'll see in the higher grades. And then school size also does matter, because if you think about it, you're now trying to share the same level of cost over a smaller population of students. So you still have the cost of operating the building. You still have a principal in the building. You still have an AP in the building, but you may have a smaller number of students. And therefore, if you're trying to compare per pupil funding at different schools, you're probably going to find that they're not going to match up. And again, I come back to the statement at the beginning. Remember that equity is not the same as equal. All right. So what happens next? When are we going to have better numbers to look at? So initial budgets were due Monday of the week. We started doing detailed reviews with, as I said, with all the schools this week. So it's 41 different touch points for the budgetary review meetings. We've got to go through our invest and disinvest options no later than 12/17, and making sure everything that we're doing is in alignment with our ESSER and ARP funding. School governance councils have their review at the same, their last review at the same time. And then we're building up to, and remember the holidays are thrown in the middle of this as well, that the January 12th Finance Committee is going to be the first look at really at any level of detail for the 22-23 budget. And that's where we're going to have sort of publicly available data down to a pretty high level of detail. But just as a preview, where initial indications right now as the budgets are starting to roll up is that we're fairly close to the $424 million that we have budgeted this year. But so with some shifting in resources that as we're planning through this process, which is what I fully would have expected. Okay. At that point, I think I will yield the mic back to the superintendent.
Thank you, Chief Penn. Again, I know that was a lot of information, but we really wanted to make sure that we let you into understanding what the current funding for Hartford Public Schools is, what our past situation has been, what is it that we have to think through now that we have the additional stimulus funds, and then, of course, the actual allocation process and what that looks like. So I don't know, team, our technology team and support team, if there are any questions. Mr. Fergus, if there are any questions. I know that we had a session already with our school governance councils when we had over, I don't know, over 100 participants there. So we got some good questions there. So perhaps the questions came into that space, but just checking to see.
Yes, Superintendent Torres Rodriguez and Chief Penn, we do have a few questions. And a couple of these I think you've addressed, but I'm going to ask them just to repeat that. Are the school budgets predetermined?
Generally speaking, no. Right? There is flexibility that takes place with the flex dollars that they're able to decide how they want to spend those. But we are trying to follow the equity model with some fidelity this year to make sure that, again, we're aligning the resources to where the need is.
And team, if you want to go back to slide 24 and maybe 25, there's Chief Penn, like what, for example, in this slide here, we see, for example, stipends. There are schools that might have stipends for different leadership positions or teacher leaderships or clubs and things like that.
That's right.
And in the other slide, oh, you spoke to the flexible dollars.
Yep.
That are allocated to all of the schools. And there's also in the next slide after this, team. For example, there are magnet supplements, and so the magnets, there's a decision there at the local level as to those supplemental funds. The same thing for the flexible dollars across all of the schools. That's a great question.
So there was actually a follow-up to that you were just you were answering a follow-up question, but I'm going to ask it. I'm going to ask it again just to so it's asked. Do schools have disposable budgets for student, family, community activities? And I think that's what you were just saying. But and how is that determined?
Yes, so it is partly with the flexible dollars. And I also will say that, one thing that is not necessarily part of this, the general budget funding allocation, we're actually tomorrow, Thursday, we're rolling out the equity innovation grants. Actually, our school leaders don't know this yet. So hold off until tomorrow morning when I present to them. But what that is as part of our ESSER and ARP, we did set aside, I think it's close to or a little over $500,000. Chief.
That's right. That's right.
For what we're calling equity innovation grants for schools to apply. And it's based on specific criteria, and quite frankly, is as long as it's aligned to our priorities and to some of our goals like graduation, literacy, student engagement, schools can apply. And we're hoping that there's something that they want to do that either they've tried and they don't have more funding for it, but they really want to continue to do it because it's like working for kids or for staff, or something new that they might want to try. But we really hope that schools take advantage of that. And what's exciting, in addition to the extra funding, what's exciting is that we're going to develop a process where we're going to have students, we're going to have teachers, and we're going to have parents that are going to be part of, and Chief Penn, and that are going to be part of the selection process for that. So I know that wasn't specifically the question, but when I heard about, for things that schools might want to do, is there funding for that? Yes, the flexible dollars and these other grants that we ourselves are going to be making available for schools.
When will we be able to see our school's budget?
Yeah, I think you probably will be able to see it certainly no later than it's approved by the Board of Education. That would be our goal once it's finalized in sort of mid-February. I will work with our Allaview partners to see if there's a way that we can share the preliminary data prior to that date. And as I said, all of the school governance council chairs have access to the school-based data right now.
What is being done to promote student mental health?
That is a great question. So I know that at the school level, in addition to having the additional 20 social workers and an additional 10 clinicians, we've also partnered with our community-based providers to be in our schools to provide the support directly to the students while they're in school, and even to some of our families that have been accessing the supports in our schools. We're taking a holistic approach because we really want social and emotional learning opportunities for students in classrooms, in groups, in advisory period, during the circles. And really, we're hoping to not only provide those ongoing opportunities for students to build relationships with their peers, but also with the adults in our schools. But we're also having additional enrichment opportunities. For example, we know that we've expanded our sports across all grade levels. And we just launched our Saturday Academy, which is another opportunity for students to have access to enrichment opportunities because yes, we want to make groups and counseling, if necessary, available to our students, but we also want them to have opportunities outside of those so that they can, have opportunity to have fun and interact with one another and find joy. So it's a variety of things that we're looking to do. We're always, looking for and open to suggestions as well.
So Dr. Torres Rodriguez, you kind of answered my next question again. So it was about after-school programs. Would that also be included in that group that you were just naming?
Absolutely. I can expand on that. So one of the pieces of feedback that we heard when we did the engagement for the strategic plan and the ESSER and ARP, the relief funding, was extended learning opportunities. And so that is after school programming that we have. And there are schools that for the most part, all of our schools have a partner that provides after school programming. And if there is a school that does not have after school programming, I encourage you to call the Welcome Center because there are other agencies in our community that we can help identify. We have the Saturday Academy. Saturday Academy goes across all grades. It's the first time that we're doing that. And it's exciting because I was just there on Saturday and students were, not only were they engaged in having fun, but, there were students from across all of our schools, kind of learning from and interacting with one another. The other piece that we're adding is it's not coming yet, but it will before you know it, the intercession. And, there are families that express to us that, during the vacation time, if we were going to have opportunities to extend learning and activities for students. So we do have all of those and we continue to listen and hear. And so if you have feedback for us, please connect with us. And who knows, that might be a perfect opportunity for one of those equity innovation grants. Certainly if you're in a school, if you're a staff member, mention it to your school leader after tomorrow that equity innovation grants are going to be available and that you have some ideas for those.
So those are the end of the questions. I would just add on to that. Where will they see what we were just discussing in terms of, say after school programs or mental health supports? Is that listed separately? Like, where do they see that when the budget does become public? Is it school-based or where would they look for that in the budget?
That's a great question. And it gives us something for us to think about so that we can be very explicit as to how that's showing up. I would say that it does show up in terms of staffing. I'll give you an example. There are student engagement specialists, right? Those are key positions across schools. And while they're not delivering counseling per se to students, they are working with students that either are not as fully engaged or need additional supports. We have our family and community support providers, right? They might not be providing direct group support or counseling to students, because social workers are supporting with that, but they are supporting with our families and linking families to supports and resources that they might need. So the other piece is, you know, on our website, we do have information about our partners, but we certainly, that question makes me think about how else can we get better at making that information available and accessible. So I appreciate the question, and it kind of prompted me to think about, okay, that means that we have to do a better job at communicating that and making the information accessible. So learning for me, and I appreciate that.
And those are all our questions for this evening.
Hey, Mr. Fergus, it looks like we had one come through our Q&A.
Oh, let me see here. Does the district plan to expand as a savings for energy? Does the district plan to use any green energy technology to help mitigate cost over time?
So the short answer to that is yes. I mean, we're able to, yes. And of course, that's in partnership with our city. Since the city participates quite a bit to the extent that the buildings are designed and upkept. There's also a lot of work that gets done in purchasing our energy that a lot of people don't see as we try to buy as part of a consortium. Meaning that we partner up with the city to make sure as we go out and we get energy bids, we're getting the best pricing possible. But it's really a multi-pronged approach to trying to get our energy costs lower, particularly with energy costs now rising and driving up the underlying cost of electricity. That's going to become increasingly important for us to make sure we're accessing green energy as often as we can, and hopefully to become producers of our own energy as opposed to being dependent on somebody else.
I see, Chief Penn, I don't know if you were asking about the Q&A, but I see a question in the Q&A specifically about, and I love the question, I appreciate the question, what types of programs does Hartford Public Schools offer inspiring teachers of, inspiring, I don't know if that's folks that want to come to Hartford Public Schools. So I'm getting excited about reading the question. To promote diversity, example, are there any bridge programs or internships for adults that are interested in teaching, and could you post resources? I will say that this is one of our strategies, is a key strategy for us that we're investing in, because yes, we want to cultivate our talent, especially our teachers of color. And so a couple things that we're doing internally, we are looking under the leadership of Chief Dr. Curtis, who oversees our Office of Talent Management, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, developing pipelines starting internally. For example, we know that we have paraeducators and others that are in roles, but they aspire to be teachers. And so we know that I believe we had 8, for example, this past year that went into the teaching role. And so we want to continue to build and expand those pipelines for people that are currently in Hartford Public Schools. And for those that are not, absolutely, I would encourage you to visit our website for any vacancies that we might have. And we have vacancies that are one, teaching vacancies, but there are other vacancies that actually have and could lead into the teaching pipeline. And so I encourage you to reach out and connect on our website for that. It is an area that I, quite frankly, we want to get better at. I mean, Chief Penn talked about, we are competing. Right, we're competing not only with the districts around us, but I would say at this point nationally. And so we want to make sure that we build programs that we can cultivate our own. And quite frankly, that's for us to kind of think about even the students that are in our high schools now. How can we, develop programs that even they want to become educators in Hartford Public Schools? So looking at it from different, what we're calling on-ramps, different opportunities for folks to come into not only Harvard Public Schools, but into the profession here in Harvard Public Schools. So appreciate the question. It is an area that we're committed to, and would love to continue the conversation. So please reach out. Okay, there's a question about a student that is waiting information about the uniform. Ms. Alvarado, if you can take information there so that we can ensure that we reach out.
Absolutely. That's what I was going to do. I believe Kimberly did put that information on the RSVP. So her information is on there, and I am going to be reaching out to her.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Back to Mr. Fergus' team. There are no more questions?
I think we're good now. I think now for real.
Okay, this was great. This is why I love having these forums, because through the questions, that's really the best part for us, because we're able to learn about what is it that we are potentially missing, how we can communicate something better. So every day we want to get better at what we do in support of all of you and your children. And so I want to thank you on behalf of the team for joining us this evening, and also thanking Chief Penn for his leadership and work during these challenging times, and the entire team here for their support with technology and question and answer. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good